This video is by Straight Goods News, SGNews.ca.
And so what I thought I would start with was, as many people probably know, Mr. Harper received the World Statesman of the Year award about a week ago in New York City. And in response to this, a number of us, No Work Pay, Raging Grannies, Indigenous Environmental Network, CUPW, PSAC, National Capital, and we organized a little press conference at the CEP's boardroom, where we presented Mr. Harper with a Richard Nixon Prize. Unfortunately, Stephen didn't show up to our presentation, so I had to give the presentation to an empty chair, sort of how Clint Eastwood did it. And our Richard Nixon Prize was to Stephen Harper. After a thorough analysis of his foreign policy, we found that he had a principled, forthright, and steadfast international policies in the interests of the rich and powerful, regardless of the consequences. So that was the reason this coalition gave him the prize, which he didn't show for. And we found that in presenting to him, the granting committee decided that Harper was to be celebrated for his consistent backing of North America's top 1% of income earners, with a special emphasis on those who made their billions from resource extraction, weaponry, and banking. And in looking into his foreign policy, we looked at all different areas of Harper's foreign policy. We looked at his role in Afghanistan, where the granting committee of the Richard Nixon Prize found that he despite what most Canadians wanted of returning Canadian troops home, he maintained Canadian troops there. When parliamentarians asked some uncomfortable questions about detainees, he held firm and just closed shop. And so the granting committee really celebrated Harper for this forthright policy. As well as, of course, his willingness to maintain 1,000 Canadian troops, maintain Canadian special forces who partake in those nighttime assassination raids. So the granting committee was very celebrated Harper's policy in this front. The main way in which we celebrated Harper's foreign policy in giving him the Richard Nixon Prize was the environmental policy. Harper has shown a willingness to challenge those in Washington and Europe who call the tar sands dirty oil. At international climate negotiations meetings, he's repeatedly made the tough decision to support more carbon in our atmosphere, despite what the overwhelming consensus around the world is on the issue. So we granted Harper with the Richard Nixon Prize. Unfortunately, I don't have the actual prize that Joe from No War put together, but it was a nice little award that I'm sure will go in Stephen's trophy case somewhere. In being more serious about these issues, the reality is, and if you look into Canadian foreign policy, the consequences are severe. Right? It's not a laughing matter. It's not a joke. Contrary to what many people portray Canadian foreign policy, Canada is a G7 nation. It is a powerful country that has major consequence, has significant consequence around the world. And we see right now, when looking at Canadian foreign policy, we see on so many different fronts, Canada further impoverishing already poor people, pushing towards more militarism. On the question of Iran right now, right? Canada's at not talking about moving towards a war with Iran, but is involved in a low-level war against Iran as we speak, with the explicit intent of crushing Iran's economy, right? To the point, the sanctions Canada has against Iran are so severe that TD Bank is shutting down the bank accounts of Iranian Canadians who are getting pensions from Iran, getting $500 a month. Because the intent of the sanctions are to crush the country's economy, right? The Canadian naval vessels that are patrolling off the coast of Iran, running provocative maneuvers, looking for a response that might lead to a justification for a U.S.-Israeli bombing campaign. The Canadian troops are occupying country bordering Iran, right? Long-standing allegations of Canadian spying in Iran. The comments of Defense Minister McKay, where he talks about how the Defense Department is planning for a war against Iran, right? There is a serious campaign ongoing that Canada is involved with against Iran, under the guise that Iran is supposedly building nuclear weapons, right? Even though we have lots of confirmations, national intelligence estimate of the U.S. back 2007, reaffirmed in 2011, that there's no evidence that as of 2003, end of 2003, that's when Iran stopped moving towards possibly building a nuclear weapon. But this is being done. The whole justification against Iran is their nuclear weapons, alleged nuclear weapons program. This is being done alongside our allies, Israel and the U.S., which don't have possible nuclear weapons programs. But in the case of Israel, we're talking about 100 to 300 nuclear weapons. In the case of the U.S., we're talking about 5,000 nuclear weapons. And we're talking about, in the case of the U.S., spending $60 billion a year on its nuclear weapons program, which is 4 times Iran's entire military budget. Right? So the hypocrisy and the double standards are completely off the charts in the question of Iran and where that could be used. Additionally, when we look at Canadian foreign policy in a place like Haiti, which we'll get to in more detail, the response after a devastating earthquake is not to send heavy urban search and rescue teams to get people out of the rubble. It's to send 2,000 Canadian troops to secure order in Haiti on behalf of the not 1% in Haiti, the 0.1% of Haiti that runs that country, has been running that country for 200 years. And as I mentioned, I think the most destructive, the most criminal, really, I think is the word we should use, most criminal element of Harper's foreign policy is on the environmental front. And is, as some people may have seen a couple of days ago, a study commissioned by 20 governments around the world suggesting that if we don't reduce carbon emissions between now and 2030, 100 million people will die because of climate disturbances. We're already talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people dying every year because of climate disturbances. And yet the Harper government is at the forefront of blocking international climate change negotiations. Year after year, repeatedly receives the Fossil of the Day award. The Harper government is at the forefront, is pushing tar sands interests, dirty oil interests in the U.S., lobbying in the U.S., in Europe. Right? When there's any movement towards a low-carbon fuel standard in the U.S., when California pushes a low-carbon fuel standard, it's Canadian diplomats that are on the ground lobbying against, going to Wisconsin's legislature and trying to block a low-carbon fuel standard. Right? So in Europe, lobbying hard against the Fuel Quality Directive. So lobbying hard against small steps to reducing the incredible devastation that comes alongside climate disturbances and global warming.